Head over to BoardGamePrices.com to find the best price on Haven and thousands of other games. Hello my friends, it's the Game Boy Geek here, and today we find ourselves in a mysterious forest where one of us is going to play the forest and the creatures, and the other player is going to play the city in this asymmetrical two-player sort of tug-of-war game. This is from Red Raven Games. Let me show you how it's played. I'll see you on the other side. The object of the game is to have the most points at the end. One of the main ways to get points is to win these victory point cards that we've set aside at the beginning of the game. These three about elements you'll be winning by having the most total lore, meaning adding up the numbers of each of the tokens of each element type and trying to have a higher value total than the opponent to win these victory point cards. And you'll also gain points by being the Haven Guardian, and you'll get that by controlling more havens than your opponent. And looking at this picture here, you can see that the board is broken up into 10 different havens as numbered here. So you're going to be trying to control more of these than your opponent. We'll talk about how to do this more later. Now the flow of the game will go back and forth, starting with the city player who takes the first turn, and then you'll be going back and forth between each of the players. And during each player's turn, you're going to be performing up to 2 actions. You're going to be then drawing cards, resolving possible battles, and then maybe doing offerings, and then ending your turn. So let's go through these different phases. So in the perform 2 actions phase, you can perform up to 2 actions. You're not forced to do 2, but you have to take at least 1 action. Let's go through the 3 different possible things you can do. The first is adding a seeker. Now there's 2 different ways you can do this. One of the ways is taking it from the top of your seeker deck. Now when you do this, you must first say before you draw this card which one of those elements it's going to be going under. And then you'll draw this card, and without looking at it, again, you had decided which one this was going to, and then you'll flip it just like that. So if you take it from your seeker deck, you must say where it's going before you look at it, and then it gets placed in front of that element. In this case, I had said before I wanted to go under the leaf. Now what you're trying to do when placing these seekers is to try and have the total lore amount, which is the total of all the numbers on your placed cards under that lore token, be as close to that lore token value as possible without going over. For example, we now have a total of 4, and we want to get to as close as 6 as possible, and I'll show you more about how this works in detail in the resolve phase in just a little bit. Now you could decide any of them, but in this case I decided that leaf. The other way you can add a seeker, now again, you're getting up to 2 actions. This was 1. For your second action, you can do the same thing, adding a seeker, but adding it from your hand. When you add one from your hand, you actually get to see what this is, because this is, you can see this, but your opponent cannot. You can then put it face down in front of any one of these 3. So I could place it here, here, or here. Now, you can see this. They can't when you're placing it down. So you know what it is, but let's say we do like this. So I know what this is, you know what this is, but the other player does not. Now another possible action you can take is to remove a seeker. Now when you do that, you can remove any seeker on your side of the elemental tokens, and when you do that, you can discard them. Let's say I wanted to discard this one, let's just say. And when you discard a card, you'll place it face down under the certain deck that corresponds with, and you can never look through the discard pile unless a card tells you. Another possible action you can take is called playing a lore power card. And they look like this, and if you play that card, you'll read it and do its action, like this one says, inspect your discarded seekers and put one into play face down. So in this case, we could go through, and that's the card that will allow you to do what I just said. And after you do this, this will get discarded as well, unless the card says to leave it out until a later time. After you've taken up to your 2 actions, you'll be drawing 2 cards. Now when you draw 2 cards, you can take from any pile in any order, and you can look at the card you took before you decide your second card. Like, maybe we draw this one, see what it is, and then decide maybe to draw something else. Now, if you do not have an offering card in your hand, you must draw one, because you always have to have one of these in your hand at least and when you end this specific phase. Now, if when drawing these, it's a card that actually says play immediately, you must then play this immediately, and you'll place it face up underneath that specific element. We'll talk about how this plays into the game in just a moment, because this is going to help these resolve to see who wins these tokens. We'll get to that in the next phase. After the draw 2 cards phase, we're going to move to the resolve phase. And what you're going to look for is for each of these lore tokens, you're going to look at that column, you're going to look at both sides, and you're going to see, are there 3 offering cards there? Now here we have a leaf, so we have a leaf here, and a leaf here, that's 3. Now earlier we talked about these elemental cards that come, sometimes you draw a card and you have to play them immediately on that corresponding lore. Now, this also counts as an offering, so this would be considered 1 card. But over here we have 3. Now we're going to talk a little bit later about how these get played and when they get played, because it's in a phase a little bit later in the round. But here we do have 3, so we begin to resolve this. Now, if more than one of these lore tokens have 3 offerings, you'll resolve them left to right from the active player's perspective. So when resolving, the first thing you'll do is flip face up any face down cards that either player has on their side for that lore. Then you'd add up the numbers on each side of the total lore. So here we have 3, 4, 5. Here we have 4, 5, 6. The lore value here is 6. If either player's total lore value is higher than this, then all of the cards from that player's side will get discarded from this specific lore column. Now keep in mind, you can actually overshoot that lore number throughout the game. It's only when there's 3 offerings and that lore tile is being resolved that then those cards will get discarded if you overshot it. And that's one of the reasons why we talked about earlier, discarding cards is sometimes you'll want to discard it so that you don't overshoot it when it's resolved. So in this case, if it was 7 or more total on either side, those players' cards would get discarded. Then you'd resolve combat. You'd look at the number of weapons on each side. This card has 1 weapon, it's a little sword there. This one has 2. This player has a total of 3 weapons. Over here, there's 1 arrow, so it's 3 to 1, so the city player would win the combat. Now, if it looked like this and it were tied, like there was just 1 sword versus 1 sword, you'd look at which player has the most total cards on their side. And this includes seekers, offerings, and any possible elemental cards that might be there. In this case, this player has 1, 2, 3, 4. This player has 1, 2, 3. So this city player would win. Now, if at that point it was still tied, since you're resolving combat, the city player always wins the second tiebreaker. That player will look for the leaf elemental standee and place on that shrine their token. Remember, the city won, so it's on the city side. The person who lost this battle will place this on any other shrine on the board. It no longer has to be on the outward facing ones. That was just to start the game. Now earlier I had showed you how the different havens are sort of separated out the board. You look at these roads like this, and this is considered to be one haven. Now let's assume that when you place a token, you actually have a majority of the shrines around a haven. For example, let's say that elemental standee was here when we just won. Well, that city player would place it here, that other player would move this, and now around this, there's 4 shrines. The majority means you have to have at least 3, so here we have 3 of 4, and so the city player would now control that haven, and they would place their haven marker right in the middle of that to show that. So we just resolved the combat, and now we're going to resolve the lore. To do that, you're going to add up the total lore values of all the cards on each player's side. This player has 4, this player has 6, 4 plus 2. This player has more lore, so they are going to win the lore. And when you win it, you're going to be winning this token. Now in a tie for lore, 6 to 6, you would again look at the amount of cards on each side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, just like you would when a tie for the combat. And whoever has more cards on their side would win it. If it's still tied, unlike combat, in a second tiebreaker, the farthest side always wins the lore. And the player that wins that token places it near themselves on their side of the board, face up. Now this is important to the game because remember, at the end of the game, you're going to get 1 point for each of these tokens you have, and you're going to be adding up the values of each element and possibly winning the victory point card for that element at the end of the game if you have the highest total value of that. Then each player is going to discard all of their seeker cards and their offering cards, and the next token will be flipped face up. Now keep in mind, this is just the same value, but these are shuffled at the beginning of the game, remember? And if there's any other ones to resolve, do so left to right from the active player's perspective. Now in the case that one player lost both the battle and the lore, let's just say the city player lost both of those. They get to keep one of these cards there and discard the other. So let's say they keep this and they would discard the other, but that's only if you lose both the battle and the lore for that. Now after resolving, you'll then do an offering. Now remember, you must place one offering card during this time, and you'll always have one because in the draw two cards phase, you always end with at least one offering card in hand. And when playing an offering card, it just goes below the stack. For example, if this one was stone, it could only be placed on the stone, and again, always on your side, and you would place it on the bottom like this. If you're playing a card that has more than one, it can be played on either of those, like the water or the stone. It doesn't get played on both, it gets played on one or the other. And keep in mind, this is mandatory, you must play an offering. Next, you're going to check for the end of the game. One way to end the game is if one of the stacks of the lore tokens is completely gone, like in this case, there's no more leaf tokens. The other way the game can end is if there's one or more elemental standees placed off the board. Remember, this happens when somebody claims a shrine and there's no place for this elemental standee to go. If the game does not end at this point, play goes to the other player where they're going to run through these exact phases as well. But if the game does end, you'll flip over to the final scoring side of your player aid and you'll follow through that, which I'm going to go through now. First, you'll go through each of the elements and you'll add the total lore values of the tokens that the players have collected. For example, for the leaves, here we have 19 and here we have 17. This player has higher, so this player would win this. It's 3 victory points. Here, it's a tie, so nobody wins it. And here, this player clearly wins it, so they'll get it. Then you'll see which player claims the Haven Guardian for 5 points. It's whichever player has more Haven tokens on the board. In this case, the Forest does. If it's tied, then neither player would win this 5-point victory card. Next, each player adds up 1 point for each of the lore tokens they have, and 1 point for each of the shrines that they've claimed. And whoever has the most points at this time is the winner. If it's tied, then you add up the total lore value numbers on each side, and that player is the winner. In this case, if you add up all these numbers, they're higher than these numbers, this player would win. If it's still tied, well, they share the victory and the forest and the city learn to coexist peacefully. All right, well, there is Haven. Well, first of all, Red Raven is known for great art and great production. You can just look at a game and a box art and look at the components, look at the cards and go, that's gotta be Ryan Lockett. He stands out like you wouldn't believe. I think he is one of my favorite, if not my favorite artist in the industry. He's such a talented individual. And this one wasn't designed by him, actually. Many of the games he puts out, he does. This was designed by Al Siegert, who's done another game of his, I think, called Dingo. But you know, they're working together again. So great art and great production on this. It just looks gorgeous. I like the asymmetrical aspect where both of you are trying to do the same things, but you know, the city's better at getting, you know, breaking the tiebreakers for the combat, which gives you the area control, you know, nod. But the forest is better at the lore, which is getting the tokens and trying to win those elements at the end of the game. So I like that it's a little bit different. This is a tactical tug of war, and I really like that you're putting cards down, trying to win different things, but you're trying to win two things, both the weapons for the sort of area control aspect, and the numbers of those tiles for scoring set collection sort of at the end of the game to win points. So I love that you've got this tug of war going on. Some things you can see, some things you can't see. It's just a really interesting game. I love the press your luck element in this, which sometimes you're going to be taking cards off the top of your deck, deciding where it goes beforehand and flipping it over and seeing what happens. Because if you go over that and it resolves, you will bust and get nothing. So I like that press your luck element into this game. The game has a lot of strategy, but having that little bit of luck makes the game tense. I like the timing of the resolution of when you resolve those different, lore tokens, because, their opponent might have gone over like we just talked about, and they're going to bust, but they're not busted yet. But if you can force it to resolve, that's when it busts, so playing the timing of this is a very interesting part of the game. This game has simple rules and tons of depth, really high in what I call my depth to complexity ratio. There's just a lot here in a short amount of time. It says 45 minutes. We play it in typically 30 when we know, once everyone knows what they're doing. I like the lore cards, those sort of special abilities that allow you to sort of do things pretty powerfully. You can use one of those per turn. Those are really fun. And I like that there's some sort of things that happen if you lose. So like, if you lose both the combat and the lore, you get to place that elemental if you lose the combat, you get to place the elemental figure. Sometimes that's the most important decision of the game, depending on what's on the board, where are those figures and what's the status of those battles. Also, if you lose both, that's when you get to keep one of your seekers there. So I like how the losing player sort of gets a leg up, but keeps it very balanced. Overall, this game really, really impressed me. And I've got to say, if I had played this more before the end of the year, this easily would have been, if not the runner-up for my 2-player game of the year, but it might have beaten out Prowler's Passage for my 2-player game of the year. That's how highly I think of this. Now, anything negative? No, I can't think of anything negative other than I wish the game had a bigger board and bigger cards. Now, granted, this game, amazing value. You can get it for under $20 online. And if it was bigger, then it would probably be a $35, $40 game, and people might not want to pay that much for a quick 2-player game, even as good as this is. So I understand why they made it the size they did, but hey, I can dream, right? Bigger board, bigger cards. That's about all the negative I can say here. This is fantastic. It's getting the Saxophone Serenade for all these reasons, so let's go.
The overview in this video was shot on a Watson model Game Topper. Upgrade every game you play with the ultimate gaming accessory. Game Toppers, shipping now. Check them out at GameToppersLLC.com.